Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the annual Sunila Abeysekera commemoration lecture. Today is her birthday, and there are many of us who remember poignantly how she loved to dance to ABBA and be the star that she was whenever we were together on her birthday. So we are meeting here today to celebrate her and also to bring into focus her deep commitment to justice and equality. Today in Sri Lanka and in many countries, challenges to these principles and ideas are too many. Economies are crumbling, access to resources, to healthcare, education, and livelihoods has never been so dire in recent memory. Sri Lanka, once the aberration to neoliberal ideologies, for its commitment to sustain a strong institutional framework with resources to deliver welfare programs that enabled everyone the right to access services, is no longer able to do so. We are informed by the government and by international monetary institutions that drastic measures have to be put in place to rescue and restructure the economy. These measures, by and large, are directed to cutting down on budgetary allocations for a range of so-called subsidies. The focus is on increasing taxes, raising the cost of services such as electricity, on essential food items, on fuel. The impact is visible almost immediately with each of these measures. The poor are getting poorer. The middle classes are also facing significant reductions in their own consumption. Public services are grinding to a halt. Women face the brunt of these assaults as prevailing gender norms call on them to ensure families' welfare against all odds. So today we are very pleased to invite Dr. Sonali Deraniyagala to give this year's Sunila commemoration lecture. She knew Sunila and had worked with her many years ago. Sonali is an economist by profession and is on the faculty of the Department of Economics at SOAS, University of London, and is a visiting professor at Columbia University, New York City. She has written extensively on international trade and development, macroeconomics and poverty, macroeconomics and poverty and conflict and poverty. Sonali will speak on the human cost of Sri Lanka's economic collapse. Just before I hand over to Sonali, I just want to say interpretation in Sinhala and Tamil are available. Please click the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. And please mute your mics until the end of the lecture. Thank you. Sonali.
Thank you, Sepali. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Women and Media Collective for inviting me to give the Sunila Abeysekera commemoration lecture this year. I'm very honored to do so. And I thought I'll start by talking about not economics, but about a movie, because today is Sunila's birthday and Sunila loved movies. And I recently saw a film that she would have really loved. And the film was called, it was an Iranian film by this young director whose name is Panahi. And the film is called Hit the Road. And it's about a family going on a road trip. There is a father who has a broken leg and the leg's in a plaster. There's a wonderful 6-year-old boy who entertains us all the way through the movie. He's jumping over the father's broken leg. There is an older son who's about 20 who's driving the car, and there is the mother who's sitting in the front seat. And now we see this family, they're on the road trip. And just like any other regular family, they are arguing and they're laughing and they're singing. And we feel that we're with them in the car. And then in one very chilling moment, we see the older boy falls asleep in the car and mother cuts a lock of his hair to keep. And then we know that this movie is about loss and despair. And what's happening is that this boy is being smuggled out of Iran and given over to human traffickers, and he's leaving the country. And Iran, of course, is a country that's experiencing consistently economic collapse, political repression, and so on. And sending their son away is this family's strategy for survival. And we learned also that they've sold their house to do this, and this son is leaving. And it's an extremely exquisite, tender, it's a heartbreaking film. And it shows, I thought, that art, of course, can say much more about the human cost of economic collapse than economists ever can. And people leaving the country, of course, for survival is very familiar to us in Sri Lanka. And they leave, as migrant workers all the time. And even recently, or even during the war, people leaving illegally was also a very familiar story to us. And I also thought about this movie last week when I saw that the Sri Lankan government has opened a special new departure gate for migrant workers at the Katunayake airport and called it Hope Gate, a name that's given without any art or any irony or any acknowledgement of the complex human costs of the present crisis that are forcing people to leave. So let's move on to the economics now, which is what my lecture is going to be about. Now, we all know that Sri Lanka's economic collapse is unprecedented in terms of the country's history, and only a few countries globally right now match us in terms of how severe this crisis is. What starts as a catastrophic balance of payments crisis and a sovereign debt crisis has meant that the economy is contracting. It's getting smaller. Growth is falling at around -9% per year. There is scarcity, there is rationing, inflation is over 60%, food inflation is over 80%, and so on. And we also know what these macroeconomic numbers feel like in human terms. There's been a devastating fall in people's money incomes. Or the few surveys that have been done up to now show that 85% of households earn less than what they did before the crisis. About 60% of households have less than half the income they had prior to the crisis. About 70% of households have cut back on food. 7 million people are not consuming adequate diets. There is scarcity of medicines and rationing. So Sri Lanka has descended into a new reality, it seems like, and it's not the reality for most people of the middle income country that we used to be. Now, in this lecture, I want to look beyond these terrible immediate effects and ask some analytical questions about the longer term human costs of the crisis. And I'm going to focus on two issues. The first issue, and Sepi, you referred to it earlier, is poverty. And the second issue is inequality. So there's two issues I will talk about. And I'll start with poverty. Now, it is inevitable that the poverty rate in Sri Lanka is going to rise very sharply as a result of this, what we call economic shock that we're experiencing, the country is experiencing. And here, by the poverty rate, I mean, I'm talking about absolute poverty, and when you use global comparisons, it's that households that live on less than $3.2 a day when you adjust for purchasing power. Now, a little bit of background. Sri Lanka has seen quite a marked reduction in poverty from the mid-2000s until, say, 2019. So the poverty rate fell, that is the percentage of people who are living below a given poverty line fell from 16% in, say, 2011 to about 9% by 2009. There are, of course, big regional differences in this fall in poverty. So districts like Kilinochchi, Mullaitivu, Vavuniya, northern districts, poverty has remained consistently high. And that's also relevant to us, what we're talking about. Now, during the pandemic, since 2019, the poverty rate began to reverse. So poverty began to creep up already. So where we're standing now is at the background of this reversal. So poverty went up from 9% of the total population to 11% by 2020. And this is extreme poverty, right? Absolute extreme poverty, not having enough income for basic needs. And it's very hard to say how high this rate is going to go. Now, some estimates say 700,000 people are going to be who were not poor are going to be pushed into poverty. And in all likelihood, the figure is going to be much, much higher. So for instance, in Lebanon, where there's been this terrible crisis going on since 2019, and GDP has contracted by nearly 40%, so negative growth of like 37% and so on, the poverty rate is now like half the population is living in absolute income poverty. So by 2021, it was 55% of people who are in absolute poverty. Before the crisis, it was something like 20%. So you see, there's 35% of the population has been moved into extreme poverty. So it's kind of to stating the obvious to say that one of the most serious costs of the human costs of our crisis in Sri Lanka will be a sharp increase in poverty. But the question I want to ask is a little bit more analytical. What I want to ask is that, is this increase in poverty in Sri Lanka likely to be a temporary increase for most households? Or will a significant number of households who fall into poverty, are they likely to remain in poverty? That is, once a household falls into poverty, will they remain, because of the economic collapse of this recent year, will they remain in poverty even after or even if those economic conditions improve? So are people, once they get poor, will they remain poor once they become poor? Now, why is this important? Looking at this question is important for policy reasons, because it throws light on the texture of deprivation and hardship that this country is undergoing right now. And we need to understand, therefore, why exactly do households become poor and who becomes poor? Because we need to know we need to understand that in order to have the correct interventions. So a very useful area in the area of development economics that can be that is relevant to asking these questions is an area of theoretical and empirical area of research, which is based on the concept of what is called a poverty trap. Now, what is a poverty trap? The poverty trap model, as we call it, and I'm talking about a microeconomic model based on households. There's also a country level model, but this is a micro model. A poverty trap model is very simple, very, very straightforward. It says that households own assets, right? Those assets could be a job. It could be things like equipment, a small factory, a kade, a hopper stall. It could be a piece of land. So it's an asset. It could be human capital. It could be education, it could be qualifications, skills, and so on. So we own a range. Households have a range of assets. And there is, for everybody, there is a minimum asset threshold. So there is a level of assets that all households need to be above that level if they are to improve economically over time, and if they are to remain out of poverty. So that threshold they have to keep themselves above that threshold. Because the problem is, if their assets fall below this threshold, they can never recover. Their assets can never recover to bring up to the threshold level, which means that they're going to be in poverty in the long term, right? In an economic sense, we say this is a model where it has multiple equilibria. I won't go into that, but the equilibrium keeps you in this poverty trap. So that is where the market is going to settle. So, because there are some economists who say the market is always going to bring people out of poverty. These models say, no. The market will settle in these multiple places which are bad for most households. So that is a notion of a poverty trap. So according to this idea, poverty is not a temporary thing for many households or significant proportion, depends on the country and so on. It could be long-term. And that is that is why it's a problem. Now, there is limited research on poverty traps in Sri Lanka, but it's important for us to understand what exactly are the mechanisms by which people fall into this asset poverty. What are the ways that a crisis like the crisis we're undergoing now, how will that push people into poverty? It's easy to say, yeah, 700,000 people, 1 million, 2 million will become poor, but it's important to understand why exactly this would happen. So for this, I'm going to draw on research from other countries and say, this is what happened elsewhere, and these are the things to watch out for in the coming years in the Sri Lankan context. So the literature points to 4 reasons as to why people might fall into a poverty trap. And I'll go through very briefly all 4 of them. So first is that a crisis like the crisis, the very catastrophic crisis we're having, might force people, very obvious to most people, to switch from high paid jobs to jobs that don't pay or pay very little. So there'll be a drastic fall in income. This is especially true in countries like Sri Lanka, where 70% of our workforce are in the informal sector. And as we know, the informal sector is characterized by insecure employment, low wages, poor working conditions, jobs are not contractual, and so on. So for example, say someone is employed in a small carpentry workshop in the central province in a rural area, and she or he loses their job because at the time when there were 10-hour power cuts, say they lost their job because the workshop had to close down. Now that person needs to feed their family and has moved into working as a day laborer in agriculture, and their pay is fallen by, say, 60%. Now that the carpentry workshop never reopens. The carpenter has gone now, maybe left through the Hope Gate and gone. And so this family would be, if they're in perpetual poverty, because this region, given the crisis, there's no new workshops opening and so on. So that is a simple area. That is with jobs, right? You can lose a job and then you never regain, you never move on to a better job. Second reason why households can fall into a poverty trap is because they often have to what we call smooth consumption. So households are always engaged in smoothing consumption. And in order to smooth consumption, they sell assets. They have to sell. And there are lots of anecdotal evidence of people in Sri Lanka talking about it, pawning, selling, and so on. Why? Because most families have to maintain even basic consumption. So at least 1 meal a day, which we're talking about a lot now in Sri Lanka. And in order to even consume 1 meal a day, an inadequate meal a day, they might have to sell something, an asset. Sell a piece of land or a small piece of land. They might have to give up the lease on a 3-wheeler. Now, the problem here is that that asset was their means of improvement. Okay, with that asset, they earned an income, and they might take some of that income and invest it in buying more land or starting a little shop. And so their income goes up, their productivity goes up, they educate their children. So that asset was the means of betterment, or not remaining in the same place, of getting better and better. Now, they might have now, because it's a distress sale, they could sell that land cheap. They might have sold it too cheap, so they can never buy it back. Interest rates go up, so they can never get a new lease on a 3-wheeler. So because, again, unlike in an economics textbook, capital markets do not function perfectly in the real world. So because capital markets don't function, this household is now asset poor, having got rid of their asset, and they're fallen into a poverty trap. Now, there's a lot of research on this area, on the asset loss, on poverty research, which shows that, especially in the rural economy, there's a very large study done in Bangladesh, which was completed in 2021, but it was an 11-year study that followed farming households. And it showed how asset loss led to these households falling into poverty traps and the same finding of asset loss then was replicated for Pakistan, Myanmar, Nepal, and so on. Another area where this asset loss theory has been tested is in the aftermath of natural disasters as well. And our Sri Lankan crisis, in a way, is that kind of collapse. So there's a lot of research ranging from hurricanes in Nicaragua to drought in Ethiopia, and how all these factors lead to a loss of asset, people selling cattle, pastoralists having to sell their cattle and so on, and never being able to regain this asset. And then you're kept in poverty. Now, the third reason then for people to fall into a poverty trap is due to the loss of what we call human capital. And in economics, human capital refers to things like knowledge and skills, to health, to physical well-being, all the things that humans and people accumulate and invest in over time, and that these investments pay off in terms of increased productivity at work, and eventually in terms of increased earnings. So human capital is what we invest in ourselves to help us earn an income. Now, the present crisis in Sri Lanka also affects human capital in lots and lots of ways. And one of the most devastating ways that human capital is affected is through the effects of children's nutrition, health, and children's education. So if you take the case of these women who are drying fish on the beach in Negombo, interviewed recently, who say that they can't now, they're cutting fish all day in the hot sun, and they say that they can't even give their children one piece of fish every 2 weeks. They can't afford this. Now, we all know these anecdotes. This is just one example, so widespread. And there is a lot of evidence, very kind of lot of empirical evidence to show that undernutrition and malnutrition in children, which is terrible in itself in the moment, has long-term effects on their income earning capacity. So in this way, this leads to an intergenerational poverty trap. So for instance, undernutrition leads to wasting and stunting in children. There was a study that followed 1.2 million children over a 30-year period. And what this study found is that when economic growth had these big falls, like in Sri Lanka, when growth fell by 10%, that the rate of wasting in children went up by 17%. So very, very quick, drastic effects on children. And what this does is like stunting, wasting, and all of that. What does that do? That then impairs cognitive ability. And that has a negative effect on educational attainment. So again, there's a lot of research, sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asian countries, that shows that even if the change in a child's diet is temporary, the effect on cognitive skills and educational attainment, they exist in the long term, they persist. So a temporary shortfall has these far-reaching long-term effects. And even if there is no stunting and wasting, so lots of studies, again, countries like in sub-Saharan African countries, where there's no evidence of stunting, no evidence of wasting, but just a change in nutrition, fall in the quality of nutrition, leads to a cognitive loss. And that leads to poorer education results and less earnings in the future. Now, in the Sri Lankan case, of course, this is bound to happen. And then when you add to this the effect of school closures as well, due to a fuel crisis, the outcome could be very, very bleak. There's also human capital loss in adults due to health reasons and so on. And there is some research here on Sri Lanka, which refers to a medical poverty trap, where due to chronic illnesses like diabetes and so on, that there are families who fall into poverty, chronic illness. And of course, we can expect this to get worse with the cost of medication, the scarcity of medication, and so on. Even in rich countries or relatively developed countries like Greece, there's a big study in the British Medical Journal, The Lancet, which shows that during economic crisis and during austerity, there was an increase in mortality. There's more people dying. Can you control for everything else? And this mortality was especially among babies and among the elderly, and the elderly is 55 and up. So still people in their productive years. And there were young people dying of self-harm and suicide. And this was economic pressure. And so why was this increase in mortality? It was due to the crisis in healthcare. It's due to the cutbacks on health expenditure and so on. So again, that's got a staggering, fact. In all other OECD countries, mortality fell. In this period in Greece, it went up. Now, a fourth reason for poverty traps, and I think that economists talk about, and this is for me, quite an interesting area because it's new. And we can call that body of research, for instance, we can call it the economics of hope. And this comes from a school of economics, which we call behavioral economics, where you model how people behave and you understand how people behave and how thoughts and emotions and feelings come into economic decisions they make, and how that then affects the whole country. It affects productivity and earnings and growth and so on. And so it's a simple idea in microeconomics at the household level, but it's new. And what it says is that economic shocks and economic crises create a cognitive and a mental burden on some families and on breadwinners, so that once they fall into poverty, they behave in a manner that keeps them in poverty through no fault of theirs. But for them, surviving poverty is the only option that seems relevant or available. And this, I think, is also very, very relevant in Sri Lanka today, because people are dealing with stresses coming at them from every direction. So there's scarcity, you're in the fuel queue. The price of fuel is too high anyway, you can barely afford that. You're thinking about, oh my God, when you get out of that queue, you have to spend 300 rupees to buy a loaf of bread. How are you going to feed your children? So you cannot, so you're tired. There's a lack of leisure because you're spending all your time, gathering, hunting almost. And in this situation, you cannot think of other issues that would lead to longer term improvement. Like you can't think of your child's education. How am I going to get a better maths tutor for my child? Or how am I going to even find a tutor? Or how am I going to get the school uniform to send them to school? So you cannot, you think very narrow survival path, and that keeps a household trapped in poverty. An analogy, as a comparison that's used, is an air traffic controller who's trying to stop two planes from colliding and can only focus on the two planes, can't think of, a cloud or a sound they might hear or a crow. You can't think of anything else. You're just kind of focusing on this and trying to stop the collision. So in that way, a family is just trying to stop from, falling into worse circumstance. So this area is what economists have led this to have called this the degrading of human capabilities, so that a household has all these capabilities, but because they are filled with the lack of hope and despair, they cannot find their way. They have aspirations, but there is no agency to their aspirations. So they cannot move forward. And a huge shock, like a sudden shock, because Sri Lanka's collapse, in many ways is sudden. Okay, it was sudden. It was predicted by economists, but most people feel it in a sudden and very, very drastic way. So a sudden shock can have this huge psychological blow to families who fall into poverty, which also contributes to then not being able to recover from that situation. Now, a lot of this could, to most of us who are working in the field and so on, seems obvious, it seems common sense, but it's important that economists are finally understanding and trying to model these various issues, and that we can use the economic arguments to kind of to ask to bargain for interventions to obtain the correct type of policies to deal with this potential sharp increase in poverty. So in that context, why is this idea of a poverty trap then important in the context of the Sri Lankan crisis? I think firstly, it's important because it shows us that it's really essential to stop households falling into poverty in the first place. And any response to the crisis must prioritize that. That should be, we've got to stop more people falling into poverty, because once they fall into poverty, it's very hard to climb out. Secondly, it's not enough to say that more people have become poor. We must disentangle the reasons as to why they become poor, because that's the way that we can have the right policies, the right interventions. And it shows the poverty trap model and all these various analyses around it shows that the reason that people become poor are very complicated. And you need different sets of policies for different groups of people. And this is something that is very kind of, I think, relevant going forward, even with our staff level IMF agreement and all this, talk about fiscal consolidation. Yes, Sri Lanka needs fiscal consolidation too, but this fiscal consolidation must not affect the poor in a serious way. It's not just about, paying lip service to it. For instance, we had always now in Sri Lanka, we are talking about cash transfers. There's a debate about should this be universal? Should this be targeted cash transfers? But the poverty trap analysis shows that any intervention to deal with poverty must go beyond cash transfers. And in some from this kind of research from countries like Bangladesh, that asset transfers work a lot better than cash transfers, because the problem is people's loss of assets, not people's loss of cash, which is losing value as we speak anyway, given high inflation. So asset transfers are, could be one way, one kind of route to go by. And again, you have to identify who's lost assets. How do we make these asset transfers, subsidize credit, and so on. There is research from Nicaragua and countries like that where cash transfers plus asset transfers or grants for investment work, especially for women in female-headed households, or giving investment grants directly to women. In Mexico, the whole Progresa program again shows that it's important to shield children from human capital loss, and that can be done with the correct types of intervention. There's a lot of South African data and programs that have tried to address the economics of hope and the psychological poverty traps and so on. So from this point of view, also in Sri Lanka, we need to do the research work and the policy work. And at the moment, we are really full of anecdotes of deprivation, heartbreaking anecdotes. And we need these anecdotes because they tell us the narrative of the Sri Lankan crisis. But at some point, we also need to go beyond the anecdotes, and we need to have hard research with randomized, this way of doing this research with randomized trials and so on. So both, the finance ministries and, think tanks and so on, we need to put that work in because this is going to be a problem that's going to be there for a long time. It's not going to go away. So there's time to take, good care and do all of this research and try and understand really what's happening. Now, I'll move on then to the second issue I'm going to talk about. And the second aspect, human cost aspect of the Sri Lankan crisis. And that revolves around inequality. And I'm talking both about income inequality and wealth inequality. Of course, gender inequality comes in, but my focus today is going to be on income and wealth. Yeah. And the key question here is that will Sri Lanka's economic crisis lead to increased income inequality? And if it does, why is that a problem? Is there a human cost to increased inequality? Now, a very basic clarification here. There's a difference, as we all know, between poverty and inequality. Poverty is an absolute. Okay, you're poor if you don't have, the equivalent of $3.2 a day. Inequality is relative. It's someone's income relative to someone else's income. Okay, so it's between groups, it's between classes. Now, income inequality in Sri Lanka has been historically quite high, certainly in the last 20 years or so. We are a country with high income inequality. We measure inequality using a measure called the Gini coefficient. And according to the Gini coefficient, Sri Lanka is in the top third of the world's most unequal countries. It's higher, surprisingly, than Pakistan, Bangladesh, even India. Now, there's a lot of problems with data, but still, if you take this as an approximation, Sri Lanka has relatively high inequality. So, for instance, in terms of income inequality, the top 1% of income earners in Sri Lanka get 20% of total earned income. The top 1% get 20, the bottom 50% get only 14% of total income. Now, that's income. If we take wealth, so wealth is what you own, houses, land, stocks and shares, various kinds of assets. If you take wealth inequality, it's much worse. And that's true of every country in the world. In Sri Lanka, the top 1% owns 31% of total personal wealth. So 1% is 31%. The bottom 50%, which is most people, own only 3.7% of total personal wealth. So that's huge disparity in wealth in Sri Lanka. And even as absolute poverty declined in Sri Lanka, say from the mid-2000s till 2019, inequality didn't change. And that's concerning. It remained high. Okay, so inequality remained high even as we had a decline in poverty. Now, the question that arises and important to us is this: what can the present economic collapse mean for inequality? Will it get worse? And there's plenty of evidence, and some of this comes from the IMF itself and from the World Bank and so on, And there are studies that have used data that span 50 years, so big data sets that look at countries, time series over 50 years, and shows that in rich countries, things like financial crises and recessions lead to increase in inequality. 2009, very straightforward, there was an increase in income inequality after the Great Recession of 2009. In low and middle income countries like Sri Lanka, sovereign debt crises lead to a much bigger increase in inequality, income inequality and wealth inequality. So debt crises lead to increased inequality. And we can expect this to happen then, therefore, in the Sri Lankan case. So if there are poverty traps in Sri Lanka, there will be new segments of the population trapped in poverty while the others are not affected. So an increase in inequality. Some income earners in Sri Lanka who are in the formal sector, private sector, and so on, might have their wages and their earnings indexed to inflation. Some might have dollar incomes. So their incomes could be stay relatively high compared to the rest of the population. We have a new poor. We have segments of the middle class now falling into poverty. So again, the gap between the wealthy and the poor could increase. Yeah, so for all these reasons. Now, why is this potential increase in inequality a problem? Why, there was a time when economists thought, well, it's not a bad thing. Countries need to be unequal. You need some level of inequality because if you're not unequal, there's no class of people who are going to save money and invest and create jobs and so on. There was a time when economists thought that inequality is just a normal stage of development, that countries go from being fairly equal to being fairly unequal and then become equal again. That's a Kuznets curve, it's called. It's a completely normal thing to happen and inequality will automatically fall. Now, all that has been blown out the water. Nobody believes that anymore because the world at the moment is having unprecedented levels of inequality, really dangerous levels of inequality, and it's recognized that this is a dangerous place to be. So why? Because inequality has real human costs. And we can look at, I'm going to now go and take 3 or 4 of these human costs and look at them in a Sri Lankan context as well. So there is a myth, firstly, that inequality is good for growth. That, the myth is that those at the top are investors and they're job creators. But really, a lot of research shows that that is a myth. And what creates jobs and what creates investment is not people being rich, but there being enough demand in the country. So consumption to be high, people having good earnings that they can buy things. And that is, Sri Lanka's, we're in the opposite, we're in the other end of the spectrum on that. Demand is at an absolute low, and we've had to curtail demand in order to manage this crisis. We are curtailing, we are compressing imports and so on to manage this crisis. So that is a myth. It's not good for us. Secondly, inequality is a problem, and this research comes partially from the IMF and from the OECD and so on, that high income inequalities in fact lead to financial crisis. Now, I started saying that financial crises cause inequality or debt crisis cause, but it also happens the other way around. High inequality leads to debt crisis. So we can say that Sri Lanka's debt crisis is partly due to Sri Lanka's high level of inequality. It could be. So, for instance, the disastrous tax cuts of 2019, we could say, were partly also reflected the high levels of inequality in Sri Lanka, and those tax cuts were partly responsible for the crisis we're in. Because what do high levels of inequality do? They lead to policies that favor the rich. Okay, and why does that happen? That is because high inequality levels lead to political capture. So a small group of economically powerful, influential people can capture political power. And when they do this, they lobby, or they just, without lobbying, they just, implement policies that do not benefit the economy or the majority of the population. Of course, you don't have to say anything about this. Sri Lanka is just rife with political capture, with rent seeking and corruption. And this is morally bad, and it's bad in lots of ways, but it's also very, very bad for economic growth and economic development, which will be inclusive, that will lift people out of poverty. So even something like some policy that Sri Lanka desperately needs is moving us away from an inward-looking economy, that is an economy that's producing just for the domestic market and making us an export-led economy, needs the pattern of inequality to change, I think, because it needs, and because why are we such an import substitutionist? Why are we such an inward-looking economy? It's partly because we have such a big lobby by economically, powerful and politically connected people, which is distorting our incentive structure and which is anti-export. It's much easier for people sometimes to make money in the domestic market. So they're not willing to take that risk and push us into, take the risk that will push us into being competitive internationally and in exports. So, we could go as far as to say that in order to become an export-oriented economy, we need to work on our income distribution. We need to look at the redistributive aspects of our development process very, very carefully. Then, of course, increase inequality is harmful for public services. So, for instance, if the rich are always choosing private healthcare, there is less pressure to increase expenditure on healthcare as a percentage of GDP, say, and which would benefit the total population. There's less pressure to stop cuts in healthcare or education going forward, say, in the face of IMF fiscal consolidation. And even right now in Sri Lanka, where a small Colombo elite kind of believes that things are okay because we've had an agreement and the shopping malls are full, and there is less, therefore, concern for the serious deprivation that the majority of the people are feeling. Now, this is a symptom of our high inequality, but this then stops the right interventions being there. It takes away the pressure for the correct interventions, the priorities. What is our priority coming out of this crisis? It is that the people who are not well off become, the people of being harmed are going to be better off. Not that, those who can manage the crisis with some dip in income, it's not about them. It's about those who are the new poor, those people who feel deprivation. Now, another kind of interesting and new theoretical concept dealing with inequality is called the Great Gatsby curve. And this is something that the economists have come up with. It's called the Great Gatsby curve. Now, the Great Gatsby is an American novel from, I think, 1925, written at a time when America was an extremely unequal society, right? So that's why it's called the Great Gatsby curve. And what it says, it's similar to a poverty trap, but what it says is that when there is high inequality in one generation, say in our generation, there's high inequality in Sri Lanka, it reduces opportunities or upward mobility potential for those who are less well off in the next generation. Okay, so when there's high inequality in Sri Lanka, children from families who are not well off are going to find it extremely hard to improve themselves, even through education and so on. So it's going to be very hard for the next generation, for people who are not coming from wealthy families in the next generation, to improve their economic circumstances. So this myth that there can be always upward mobility is challenged when there is a high level of inequality. So it's like you have a ladder and you have to climb up the ladder, say. So upward social mobility involves climbing up the ladder. Now, the more unequal a country is, the gap between the rungs of the ladder get wider. So it's now harder for a child to climb up. So that's when, inequality is harmful. And this is then a real cost. It's a cost, of course, for the house, for the family, for the individual, and so on. But it's a big cost for the economy as well, because it's a huge human cost, because you're missing out on talent, on skill, on ability, because you're not having a random, selection of talent coming through. So that is a big problem. So I'm going to stop in 5 minutes, in 2 minutes. So what then? We talked about policies to deal with poverty. So we also then need, in this crisis situation, I would say, a set of policies to deal with increased inequality, existing inequality in Sri Lanka, and we have to be really watchful that inequality does not increase as a result of the crisis, and we need So any policy package we put forward, a deal between the IMF and the Sri Lankan government, what we should push for is it should include redistribution. And that is extremely important. It's not important purely to, punish those who are wealthy or to help the poor. It's important also for development and growth. It's important if we are to embark on a process of growth that would stop these kind of crises happening in the future. It's important that we limit the human costs of this crisis, and therefore we need a policy of redistribution. So we talk about taxation, and obviously taxes need to be progressive. Okay, so, think taxes like VAT are not progressive taxes. Taxes like income they're regressive taxes, VAT taxes. Taxes on income are progressive taxes. So, that's where the focus has to be expanding the tax base. It has to be increasing income tax. It has to be higher corporate tax. It has to be, there's a lot of talk about a wealth tax, and there are arguments, it's hard. People say it's hard to administer, and that it has, but, it has a disincentive effect. Now, the disincentive argument, we can economically dismantle, and we can say that's not true. And we can give them very kind of, tight, just purely economic reasons why the disincentive argument doesn't hold. But so we really need to focus on that issue of redistribution. There have been proposals, not in a Sri Lankan context, but generally there have been proposals that have talked about, this was in England actually, and then no less than the Financial Times, which is unusual. It was an opinion piece that said that in a crisis like, England's having a cost of living, which is kind of, inflation is going to go up to about 18%, they say. And there's an energy crisis with the price of, heating and so on going up, that you need a kind of solidarity tax. So this is a crisis, and that there should be a kind of solidarity tax. And who pays the solidarity tax? We need to work out in a Sri Lankan context. But a kind of idea like that this is a huge crisis. And how do we, just sticking with the status quo, with what was, is not going to get us, it's a sticking plaster. It's not going to get us fundamentally out of the crisis. So we need to really think, anew, and really, take into account these big human issues at the end of the day. Because if we don't do that, of course, we will be stuck in this kind of low investment, slow growth economy. There'll be persistent poverty, there'll be lack of hope. And there'll be, of course, huge exodus, leaving of, skilled individuals, this exodus of human capital, because, people have then no choice but to kind of leave through the, gate of hope. So, I'm going to stop there. And, so my main point is that, the human costs are extremely serious, but we really have to think very carefully as to how we address them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonali. Thank you very much. This was really a very interesting and impressive lecture to try and absorb. And it's also, it actually was the reason why we wanted to ask you to do this commemoration lecture, partly because we've been talking a lot in the last 3 months, particularly after the default, maybe in terms of how we should be responding to the economic crisis, but also the political crisis, economic reform and political reform together. And we thought to ask you in particular to speak to this, because in a way, it was also something that Sunila did all her life. I remember in about 1986, when she was introducing feminism, feminist theory, a lot of different types of analytical ideas into the women's movement. And you yourself was, I think, part of this in the early 80s when she was trying to discuss, for example, domestic violence, and you did the first piece of research, I think the first piece of feminist research in the country on domestic violence in maybe 86. Sunila at that point also introduced, I can't remember the economist's name, Maria de la Rosa, I think.
Yes.
That housework is also work. Yeah, domestic work is also work. And today, WMC is taking that forward, both in terms of research and in terms of policy, to try to see, how we can bring this into a more structural, introduce it in a more structural way into economic policy and interventions. And I think it's very important for us, exactly what you said. Even if you're looking only at the main contradictions here of poverty and of inequality, income and wealth inequality, and we would, of course, add gender inequality, that we need to do the research. This is the time to do the research, and it is the time to intervene in policy. And I think this is very much what Sunila would also have done in a way, yeah? Yes. Despite, we've all known Sunila as a rights person. We've all known Sunila as a civil and political rights advocate. And certainly she did advocate for economic, social, and cultural rights as well, real rights, a lot of things that she introduced into our work. But I think she would have also taken a step back to look at what this really means in tangible terms in relation to policy, and in particular research that underpins policies. So thank you very much for this. I'm sure a lot of people here would like to have a discussion on this, and I would urge everyone to maybe get in touch with WMC, and we can, I hope, invite you to a more a seminar that will be more inclusive and where we can discuss ideas, and particularly innovative ideas to move forward. Like you said, maybe solidarity tax, maybe different things, even in the way we analyze what's going on. So thank you all, and thank you very much, Sonali, and thank you to the interpreters as well for this. And I hope we can take this discussion forward.